Hi, welcome back to the First Presbyterian Church story time where we're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And we are on chapter 5. And if you will remember in chapter 4, Edmund had gone through the wardrobe. He had followed Lucy in there. He had met the White Witch, and he had finally come and met Lucy as he was going back to go through the wardrobe. And they were going to tell everybody that there was another world. All right, so let's begin. Back on this side of the door, because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened to be in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy bursted out. "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got to it. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund. Tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we came to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to this moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky. Remember, he ate all that Turkish taffy from the witch? And he was annoyed with Lucy for being right all the time, but he hadn't made up his mind on what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest, most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan, and Edmund gave a superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year difference. "Oh, yes. Lucy and I have been playing, pretending. That's all her story was about. A country in the wardrobe is true. For the fun of it. Of course, there's nothing really there." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success, and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? What's the worst of young kids? They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go on playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken back. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home. But since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queerer in the head or less turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good does it do thinking you'll do her jeering and nagging at her all the time and encouraging her the next?" I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think of anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better, having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy, a good deal later, everyone could see that she'd been crying. Nothing you could say to make any difference. She stuck to her story and said, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, you can write to mother, you can do anything you like. I know I met the fawn in there, and I wish I stayed there, and you all are beast, beast, beast. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working out as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passageway talking in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was that the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to father if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou, said Peter. It's getting far beyond us. So they went and they knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat and he listened to them, with the tips of his fingers pressed together, never interrupting, till they had finished the whole story. And after that he said nothing for quite some time. Then he cleared his throat, and he said the last thing either of them had expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," said Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see that the old man's face, that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they only had been pretending." "That is the point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does, to your experience, lead you to regard your brother or your sister as more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing, sir," said Peter. "Up until now, I would have said Lucy was." "And what do you think, my dear?" he said, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That is more than I know," said the professor, "and a charge of lying against someone whom you've always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed." "We were afraid it might not even be lying," said Susan. "We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean," said the professor, quite coolly. "Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her that she is not mad." "But then," said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor, and didn't know what to think. "Logic," said the professor. "Why don't they teach logic at school? There are only three possibilities here. Either your sister is telling a lie, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obviously she's not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she's telling the truth." Susan looked at him very hard, and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how could it be true, sir?" said Peter. "Why do you say that?" asked the professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time we go in the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor. And Peter didn't quite know what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended that she was away for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If I say she had gotten into another world, I would not be at all surprised to find that other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stay there, it would never take up any time here. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner, like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to the elf, I wonder what they do teach 'em in those schools. But what are we to do? Said Susan. We felt that the conversation was beginning to get off point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might try minding our own business, he said. And that was the end of the conversation. Well, after these things, there was a good deal better with Lucy. Peter saw it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become rather an alarming subject. And so far as time it took for all the adventures were coming, it looked like all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be so. This house of the professor, which even he knew very little about, was so old and so famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see it. It was that sort of a house that is mentioned in guidebooks or even in historians, and well it may be, for all manner of stories were told about it. Some of them were even stranger than this one I'm telling you now. And there were parties, sightseers, that would arrive to see the house, and the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor, the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not very fond of children, and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost the first morning, along with many other instructions, and please remember, she said, you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party around the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste our mornings trailing around with a crowd of old grown-ups, said Edmund, and the three others thought the same. That was how the adventure began, the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor, and were wondering if they could take it to bits. And the girls rushed into the room and they said, "Look out! Here comes McReady with a whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and off the four went, and they dashed through the door to the end of the room. But when they got out of the green room and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them. And realized that Mrs. McReady must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back way instead of the front way as they expected. And after that, whether it was they lost their heads or that Mrs. McReady was really trying to catch them, or that the magic of the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother with those trippers. Here, let's go into the wardrobe room. Until they pass, no one will follow us there." But at the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage. And then someone was fumbling at the door. And then they were turning the handle. "Quick," said Peter. "There's nowhere else to go." And he flung open the door to the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside it and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door close, but did not shut it, for of course he remembered, as very sensible people do, that you should never, never shut yourself up in the wardrobe. End of chapter 5. In chapter 6, we'll find out what happens in the wardrobe. Do they find Narnia or just the fur coats? And also in chapter 5, remember the professor told them, you don't have to see things to believe them. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week.